Wouldn't you like to be loved by me? She was saying. Yes, Gabriella, said the director, gleaming with sweat. I should like to be loved by you. You think I'm attractive? Under the table, the director's leg began to jiggle up and down, the spring of its flexed foot. There are better words than that for what you are. Then why don't we at least make a start at it, she said. She was working alone, and visibly weakening with every line. Before the end of the first act, the audience could tell as well as other players she'd lost her grip, and soon they were all embarrassed for her. She had begun to alternate between false theatrical gestures and a white-knuckled immobility. She was carrying her shoulders high and square, and despite her heavy makeup, you could see the warmth of humiliation rising in her face and neck. Then came the bouncing entrance of Shep Campbell, the burly young red-haired engineer who played the gangster, Duke Mantee. The whole company had worried about Shep from the beginning. He and his wife Millie, who had helped with the props and the publicity, were such enthusiastic and friendly people, nobody had the heart to suggest replacing him. The result of this indulgence now, and of Campbell's own nervous guilt about it, was that he forgot one of his key lines, said others in a voice so quick and faint that it couldn't be heard beyond the sixth row, and handled himself less like an outlaw, an obliging grocery clerk, bobbing head, rolled-up sleeves and all. At intermission, the audience struggled out to smoke and wander in uncomfortable groups around the high school corridor, examining the high school bulletin board and wiping damp palms down their slim-cut trousers and their graceful cotton skirts. None of them wanted to go back and go through with the second and final act, but they all did. And so did the players, whose one thought now, as plain as sweat on their faces, was to put the whole sorry business behind them as quickly as possible. It seemed to go on for hours, a cruel and protracted endurance test, in which April Wheeler's performance was as bad as the others, if not worse. At the climax, where the stage directions called for the poignance of the death scene to be punctuated with shots from outside and bursts from Duke's Tommy gun, Shep Campbell timed his burst so sloppily that the answering off-stage gunfire was so much too loud that all the lovers' words were lost in a deafening, smoky shambles. The curtain fell. It was a final act of mercy. The applause, not loud, was consistently long enough to permit two curtain calls. One which caught all the players in motion as they walked to the wings, turned back, and collided with one another, and another that revealed the three principals in a brief tableau of human desolation. The director blinking myopically, Shep Campbell looking appropriately fierce for the first time all night, and April Wheeler paralyzed with a formal smile. Then the house lights came up, and nobody in the auditorium knew how or what to say. The uncertain voice of Mrs. Helen Gibbon, the real estate broker, could be heard repeating, "Very nice," over and over again, but most of the people were silent and stiff, fingering packs of cigarettes as they rose and turned to the aisles. An efficient high school boy, hired for the evening to help with the lights, vaulted up on stage with the squeak of his sneakers and began calling instructors to an unseen partner high in the flies. He stood posing self-consciously in the footlights, managing to keep most of his pimples in the shadows, while turning his body so that the tools of his trade, knife, pliers, coils of wire, which were slung in a professional-looking holster of old leather on the tight buttocks of his dungarees, could be seen. Then the bank of lights clicked on, the boy made a pale exit, and the curtain became a dull wall of green velvet, faded and streaked with dust. There was nothing to watch now but the masked faces of the audience as they pressed up the aisles and out the main doors. Anxious, round-eyed, two by two, they looked and moved as if a calm and orderly escape from the place had become the one great necessity of their lives. As if, in fact, they wouldn't be able to live at all until they were out beyond the rumbling pink billows of exhaust and the crunching gravel of this parking lot, out where the black sky went up and up forever, and there were hundreds of thousands of stars. Chapter 2. Frank H. Wheeler was among the few who bucked the current. He did so with apologetic slowness and with what he hoped was dignity, making his way with sliding steps toward the aisle toward the stage door, saying, "Excuse me, excuse me," nodding and smiling to several faces he knew, carrying one hand in his pocket to conceal and dry the knuckles he had sucked and bitten throughout the play. He was neat and solid, a few days less than 30 years old, with closely cut black hair and the kind of unathletic good looks that an advertising photographer might use to portray the discerning consumer of well-made but inexpensive merchandise might pay more. But for all its lack of structural distinction, his face did have an unusual mobility. He was able to suggest wholly different personalities with each flickering change of expression. Smiling, he was a man who knew perfectly well that the failure of an amateur play was nothing much to worry about. A kindly, witty man who would have had exactly the right words to comfort his wife backstage. But in the intervals between his smiles, when he shouldered ahead through the crowd, you could see the faint chronic fever of bewilderment in his eyes. See more than he himself was in need of comforting. The trouble was that all afternoon in the city, stultified at what he liked to call the dullest job you could possibly imagine, he had drawn strength from a mental projection of scenes to unfold tonight. Himself rushing home to swing his children laughing in the air, to gulp a cocktail and chatters through an early dinner with his wife, himself driving her to the high school with her thigh tense and warm under his reassuring hand. "If only I weren't so nervous, Frank," she would have said, himself sitting spellbound in pride, and then rising to join a thunderous ovation as the curtain fell, himself glowing and disheveled, pushing his way through jubilant backstage crowds to kiss his wife. Was it really good, darling? Was it good? And then the two of them stopping for a drink in the admiring company of Shep and Millie Campbell, holding hands under the table while they talked it all out. Nowhere in these plans had he foreseen the weight and shock of reality. Nothing had warned him that he might be overwhelmed by the swaying, shining vision of a girl he hadn't seen in years. A girl whose every glance and gesture could make his throat fill up with longing. "Wouldn't you like to be loved by me?" And then, right there before his very eyes, she would dissolve and change into the graceless, suffering creature whose existence he tried to every day of his life deny, but whom he knew as well and as painfully as he knew himself. The gaunt, constricted woman, whose red eyes flashed reproach, whose false smile in the curtain call was as homely as his own sore feet, his own damp climbing underwear, his own sour smell. At the door he paused to withdraw and examined the pink-blotched hand from his pocket, half expecting to find it torn to a pulp of blood and gristle. Then pulling his coat straight, he went through the door, and up the steps into a high, dusty chamber, filled with the raw glare and deep shadows cast by naked light bulbs, where the laurel players, ablaze with cosmetics, stood talking to their sallow visitors in nervous, widely spaced groups of 2 and 3 around the floor. She wasn't there. "No, I mean I'm serious," somebody was saying. Could you hear me? Could you hear me or not?" And somebody else said, "What the hell? It was a lot of fun anyways." The director stood in a scanty cluster of his New York friends, pulling hungrily on his cigarette, shaking his head. Shep Campbell, pebbled with sweat, still holding his Tommy gun, but clearly himself again, was standing near the curtain rope with his free arm around his small, rumpled wife, and they were both demonstrating the decision to laugh the whole thing off. "Frank!" Millie Campbell had waved and risen on tiptoe, shout his name through cupped hands, as if pretending that the crowd were thicker and noisier than it really was. "Frank, we'll see you in April later, 'kay? For a drink?" "Fine," he called back. "Couple minutes." And he winked and nodded as Shep raised his machine gun in a comic salute. Around the corner he found one of the lesser gangsters talking with a plump girl who caused a 30-second rupture in the first act by missing her interest cue, who had evidently been crying, but now was hilariously pounding her temple and saying, "God, I could have killed myself." While the gangster, tremulously wiping grease paint from his mouth, said, "No, but I mean, it was a lot of fun anyway, and that's the important thing in a thing like this, and have a little fun." "Excuse me," Frank said, squeezing past them to the door of the dressing room that his wife shared with several other women. He knocked and waited, and when he thought he heard her say, "Come in," he opened it tentatively and peeked inside. She was alone, sitting very straight at a mirror and removing her makeup. Her eyes were still red and blinking, but she gave him a small replica of her curtain call smile before turning back to the mirror. "Hi," she said. "You ready to leave?" He closed the door and started toward her with the corners of his mouth stretched tight, in a look that he hoped would be full of love and humor and compassion. What he planned to do was bend down and kiss her and say, "Listen, you were wonderful." But an almost imperceptible recoil of her shoulders told him that she didn't want to be touched, which left him uncertain what to do with his hands. That was when it occurred to him to say that "you were wonderful tonight." It might be exactly the wrong thing to say, condescending or at the very least naive and sentimental and much too serious. "Well," he said instead, "I guess it wasn't exactly a triumph or anything, was it?" And he stuck a cigarette jauntily in his lips and lit it with a flourish of his clicking Zippo. "I guess not," she said. "I'll be ready in a minute." "No, that's okay. Take your time." He pocketed both hands and curled the tired toes inside his shoes, looking down at them. Would "you were wonderful" have been a better thing to say after all? Almost anything, it now seemed, would have been a better thing to say than what he had said. But he'd have to think of better things to say later. Right now it was all he could do to stand here and think about the double bourbon he'd have when they stopped at their way home with the camels. He looked at himself in the mirror, tightening his jaw, and turned his head a little to one side to give it a leaner, more commanding look. The face he had given himself in the mirror since boyhood, and which no photograph had ever quite achieved, until with a start he found that she was watching him. Her own eyes were there in the mirror, trained on his for an uncomfortable moment before she lowered them to stare at the middle button of his coat.